I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday in October. The kind of October day that feels like the world is slowly letting go of something. The leaves weren't golden and pretty the way they are in pictures. They were brown at the edges, curling inward, releasing their grip on the branches one by one. I was standing at my kitchen window, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching the oak tree in the backyard drop its leaves onto the grass I hadn't gotten around to raking. And my phone was sitting on the counter behind me, face down, silent. I had called her 3 times that morning. Well, she hadn't answered. That wasn't new, not exactly. There had been weeks, long, aching stretches of weeks, where our conversations had grown shorter, thinner, like a piece of paper folded too many times. But something about that particular morning felt different. Something in the silence felt final in a way I wasn't ready to name yet. The coffee was cold, the yard was a mess. And somewhere about 45 minutes away, my daughter was living a life that no longer seemed to have a place for me in it. I didn't cry that morning. I just stood there watching the leaves fall. I think that's what real grief feels like when you're older. It doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it just settles, quiet and heavy like frost on a window. You don't feel it arriving. You just look up one day and realize everything has gone still. My name is Carol. I'm 62 years old and I am still learning what it means to love someone without losing yourself in the process. This is the story I never thought I'd have to tell. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio, the kind of place where people stayed, where your mother knew your teachers by name, where you graduated high school and maybe went to the community college 20 miles away, and then you came back and you built something small and steady and yours. My own mother had done exactly that, and her mother before her. I married young, 23, to a man named Dennis who had kind eyes and a nervous laugh and a real gift for fixing things around the house. We weren't passionate in the movie's sense of that word. We were practical. We were partners. We built a life the way people built houses back then, slowly, carefully, one room at a time. Our daughter Megan was born 18 months after our wedding. August baby. A July heatwave had kept me miserable for most of that summer, and I swear she came into the world already furious about the heat, eyes wide open, fists clenched, hollering like she had something to say and no time to waste. The nurses laughed. I remember lying there exhausted and feeling this enormous flooding love, the kind that takes your breath away, the kind you are completely unprepared for no matter how many people tell you it's coming. She was mine. She was the best thing I had ever done. Dennis and I didn't have much money in those early years. He was working at a machine shop and I'd taken a part-time job at the elementary school, aide work, nothing glamorous, but I was good at it and I loved the children and I loved being home by 3 in the afternoon when Megan got back from school. Our house was small and always a little cluttered and I made a lot of things from scratch because it was cheaper that way. Bread, soup, birthday cakes decorated with frosting that never quite looked the way I intended. Megan used to sit on the kitchen counter and watch me bake. That was her spot, that stretch of countertop between the refrigerator and the stove, her small legs dangling, a glass of chocolate milk in her hand. She'd ask questions constantly. Why does bread rise? Why do you use butter and not margarine? Can I lick the spoon? And I'd explain, or I'd say I didn't really know, and we'd figure it out together sometimes. The two of us, in that warm kitchen that always smelled like something baking or something simmering or something good. Those years were not perfect. Dennis and I struggled. Money was tight. Some months were very tight. There were arguments behind closed doors, the kind that Megan probably heard through the thin walls of that little house whether we wanted her to or not. But we were together. We were a family. And whatever was breaking between Dennis and me, Megan was always what held us in the same orbit. She was 12 when her father and I separated. I won't spend too much time on that part of the story because it isn't really the heart of this one. Dennis wasn't a bad man. He just became someone I didn't know how to reach anymore. We tried longer than we should have maybe, and then we stopped trying and we told Megan together, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in spring. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes very still, and then she nodded once slowly and said, "Okay." And that single word, so contained, so careful, broke my heart in a way I didn't fully understand. And until years later, she adapted, children do, but I watched her through those adolescent years build a careful wall around herself. Not against me, not exactly. She was always warm with me, always affectionate in her quiet way, but against the idea of needing people too much. Against the vulnerability of depending on someone who might one day not be there. I recognized it because I'd done the same thing. I raised her mostly on my own after that. Dennis stayed in the picture. He took her on weekends, called on weekdays, showed up for her school events, but the daily reality of Megan's life was mine. The lunches packed at 6 in the morning, the homework at the dining room table. The nights she came home from school with that expression on her face that meant something had happened, something social and painful and complicated, and I'd sit beside her on her bed and say nothing for a little while, just being there, letting her feel whatever she needed to feel before the words came. That was the relationship I thought we had, that closeness, that trust. I wasn't wrong to think it existed, it was real. But something can be real and still not be strong enough to survive everything that comes after. Megan was 26 when she met Ryan. She'd been living in Columbus by then, working for a marketing company, sharing an apartment with 2 college friends. I drove up to see her once a month. We'd meet for lunch, walk around her neighborhood, talk for hours. I loved those visits. She was becoming someone so interesting, so her own person, and I felt this fierce, quiet pride every time I sat across from her at a restaurant table and watched her talk about her life with that intensity she'd always had. Ryan was at a company event. That's how she described it the first time she mentioned him. I met someone at this work thing. Casual, deliberately casual, the way Megan got when she was protecting something new that she wasn't sure about yet. I didn't push, I waited. Over the next few months, he materialized slowly, then all at once in the landscape of her stories. Ryan said this, Ryan and I went here. Ryan thinks that. I listened carefully the way mothers do. I was looking for the shape of him in the spaces between her words, trying to understand what this person was to her and what he might become. He was from Connecticut. His family had money, real money, not aggressive about it, but present, woven into everything, the way a particular upbringing makes itself known in a person's carriage and their expectations and the restaurants they consider ordinary. He'd gone to a good school. He worked in finance. He was 31, a few years older than Megan, steady and confident and apparently very certain about what he wanted. What he wanted was my daughter. I liked him the first time we met. I want to say that clearly because what came later can make that hard to believe, and I think honesty matters here. We had dinner, Megan, Ryan, and I, at a nice restaurant in Columbus, and he was warm and polite and genuinely funny in a dry, understated way. He asked me questions about my life, real questions, and he listened to the answers. He looked at Megan the way a person looks at something they're still a little amazed they get to have. I drove home that night feeling something that I told myself was happiness, and maybe it was. Maybe it was also something else, something careful and quiet living just beneath the happiness that I didn't want to examine too closely yet. They got engaged 14 months later. The wedding was beautiful. I have to say that and mean it because it was. It was held at a venue in Connecticut, Ryan's family's home territory, a restored barn on a property that sat in the middle of autumn countryside, surrounded by hills going orange and red. Everything was tasteful and elegant and exactly right in that studied, coordinated way that Ryan's mother orchestrated with the quiet authority of a woman accustomed to making things happen. His mother, Patricia, she was not unkind to me. I want to be clear about that too. Patricia was gracious and welcoming and gave me a warm hug at the rehearsal dinner and told me I must be so proud of Megan. And I said so. But there was a world between us, Patricia and I, not a hostile world. Just a wide, quiet distance of different references and different assumptions and different senses of what ordinary life looks and feels like. And Megan, as the months after the wedding accumulated into years, seemed to be learning to live in Patricia's world. Seamlessly, effortlessly, the way she had always been good at adapting, while mine receded into the background. It happened slowly. I can't point to a single moment where the shift occurred, which I think is the nature of these kinds of losses. They don't announce themselves, they accumulate. The monthly lunches in Columbus became less frequent when Megan and Ryan moved to Westport. That was understandable. The distance was real, almost 9 hours by car. We shifted to phone calls, which were fine at first, warm and long, and then became shorter, more scheduled, more like appointments. She called on Sunday afternoons, usually 45 minutes to an hour. We talked about her work, about Ryan's work, about home renovations and travel plans and a wine tasting trip to Napa. I told her about my garden, about the women in my book club, about the new art class I'd started taking at the community center on Thursday evenings. She listened, she asked follow-up questions, she laughed at the right moments. But something was different, something in the quality of her attention. There was a glass wall between us that hadn't been there before, thin and invisible and very hard. I started to understand it. The Thanksgiving, she told me, they'd be spending the holiday in Connecticut for the 2nd year in a row. Ryan's whole family comes to his parents' place, she explained. It's kind of their thing, it's always been their thing. Of course, I said, and I meant it. I wasn't petulant. Maybe Christmas then. A pause, small but significant, the way Megan's pauses had always been significant. We're actually thinking about doing a little trip, just the two of us. Ryan has been working so hard, we both have, and we just want. That sounds wonderful, I said, really. And I let her hear the smile in my voice, and she thanked me, and we talked about the trip for a few more minutes. And then we said goodbye, and I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet house and looked at my hands for a long time. It was November. Outside, the last few stubborn leaves were clinging to the branches. I spent Christmas that year with my sister Barbara and her family, 2 states over. It was fine. Barbara always makes things warm and full of food and noise, but I found myself, more than once, slipping into the feeling that I was a guest in someone else's celebration rather than a part of it. That's a loneliness specific to the holidays. You can be surrounded by people who love you and still feel the specific absence of the person you're looking for. I looked for Megan in rooms she wasn't in. I know how that sounds, and I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to cast myself as a victim and my daughter as a villain. The truth is so much more complicated than that, and I've spent enough time now sitting with the complexity to know that easy stories about heroes and villains rarely capture what actually happens between a mother and a daughter over time. What I felt was real. What she was building, a new life, a new family unit, a new set of traditions and loyalties, was also real and legitimate and hers to build. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time. But in the middle of that Christmas, I wasn't yet wise enough to hold both things at once. I just felt the missing. The calls continued through the winter and into spring. They remained polite, warm at the surface, careful. I began to notice that Megan rarely volunteered personal details anymore about her inner life, her doubts, the texture of her daily experience. She'd share facts. They were redoing the guest room. Ryan's firm had a good quarter. She'd started a new workout class. But the underneath, the real territory of who she was becoming had become private in a way it never used to be. I mourned that, quietly to myself in the way that felt appropriate. I didn't burden her with it. I was good at carrying things quietly. Maybe too good. The call that changed everything came in April. She called on a Wednesday, which was unusual. She always called Sunday. I answered on the second ring, hearing something in the timing itself. Mom, her voice was careful in the way it gets when she's prepared for a conversation. Hey, sweetheart. I want to talk to you about something. I've been thinking about it for a while and I wanted to. I think we need to talk about how things have been. I sat down. My heart had already started that low, anticipatory ache. Okay, I said, I'm listening. What followed was one of those conversations that is painful not because of cruelty, but because of the absence of cruelty. Because what she said was measured and thoughtful, and, in its own way, kind, and somehow that made it harder. She said she felt like I held on too tightly, that when she didn't call for a week, she could feel the weight of my waiting, that my expressions of missing her, which I'd always thought I was keeping moderate, contained, had begun to feel like a kind of pressure she carried into her daily life, that she loved me, that she knew I'd sacrificed everything for her. And that those sacrifices, she said, very gently but very clearly, had sometimes felt less like gifts and more like debts she didn't know how to repay. There was more. Some of it I can still only think about in pieces, not all at once. She said she'd talked to Ryan about it. She said she'd talked to a therapist about it. They'd both apparently agreed that she needed more space. I don't remember exactly what I said in response. I know I didn't cry, not on the phone. I asked a few questions, careful, reasonable questions, because even in that moment some part of me was managing how I appeared, the way I'd learned to do. I told her I understood, because what else do you say to your daughter in that moment? What other door is there? We said goodbye, I hung up. And then I sat in my kitchen, my quiet, sunlit kitchen with the plants on the windowsill and the chipped coffee mug I'd had for 15 years, and I did not move for a very long time. The weeks after that phone call were the strangest weeks of my life. Not the hardest. I've had hard weeks. I've known grief up close in its most serious forms. But these weeks had a quality unlike anything I'd experienced before. They were gray in a specific way, like being inside a house where someone has covered all the windows with light fabric, not dark exactly, but muffled, softened into something close to unreality. I went through my routines. I got up. I made coffee. I went to my part-time work at the school library where the children were loud and busy and blessedly indifferent to my interior state. I came home. I ate dinner. I watched too much television. At night, alone in the house that had once held so much of Megan's noise and energy and presence, I found myself doing the accounting that grief always pushes you toward. Going back through memory, examining moments, looking for the seams where things had started to separate. Had I been too much? Had I needed too much from her? I thought about the Sunday calls, and the way I'd always looked forward to them with an intensity that, in retrospect, might have been its own kind of pressure. I thought about the birthday cards I'd sent, always a card and always a gift, always handwritten notes inside that she probably felt she had to respond to with a certain kind of warmth. I thought about the visits I'd made to Columbus in those early years after she moved, once a month, regular as sunrise, never asking if it was too much, just assuming it was what she wanted because it was what I wanted. I had loved her the only way I knew how, but love isn't always the same thing as what someone else needs. That understanding arrived in pieces, not all at once, and it hurt each time a new piece came. My friend Diane was the first person I told. We've known each other since Megan was in elementary school. We met at a school fundraiser, discovered we lived 4 streets apart, and have been in each other's lives in the quiet, sustaining way of real female friendship ever since. I called her on a Saturday morning about 3 weeks after the call with Megan and told her all of it. Sitting at my kitchen table, talking to Diane, something loosened in my chest for the first time. She didn't offer easy reassurance. That's one of the things I love about her. She said, "That sounds like it really hurt." And that was enough. That was the exact right thing. "It did," I said, and then I cried properly for the first time since that Wednesday in April. There are things you believe about yourself as a mother that you've never examined, because why would you examine them? They seem so clearly true. I love my child. I was always there for her. I sacrificed. I showed up. These things were all real. I'm not taking them back. But what I began to understand, slowly and with no small amount of pain, was that none of those things automatically translated into what my daughter had needed. Presence isn't the same thing as attunement. Sacrifice isn't the same thing as love freely given. I had given Megan everything I had, and without meaning to, I had tied a thread to every gift. Not intentionally, not consciously, but the thread was there, the weight was there. She had felt it, carried it, and eventually she had looked at it honestly in a way I hadn't been able to do. I thought about my own mother, how she had held on with both hands, how leaving home had felt like a tearing, necessary but painful, and how I had spent years managing her expectations and her emotions while also trying to build my own life. I had sworn I would never do that to my child. And here we were. The mirror is a brutal thing when you finally stop looking away from it. I'm not going to suggest I found my way to acceptance easily or quickly. There were weeks where I was angry at Megan, at Ryan, at the distance, at the life she'd built that seemed to have so elegantly solved the problem of me by simply moving me to its margins. There were weeks where I indulged in a kind of private self-pity that I'm not proud of, where I nursed my sense of loss and unfairness in the dark like a small, wounded animal. But I'm 62 years old. I've lived enough of a life to know that I cannot afford to live in those places for too long. Somewhere arrow. And early July, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. There was no single transformative moment, no epiphany in a sunset, just a quiet turning of the wheel, a slight change in direction. I decided to come back to myself. The art class at the community center had been going for several months by then. Every Thursday evening, 6 women and 2 men gathered in a room that smelled of acrylic paint and old wood floors, and a patient instructor named William with paint-stained hands and a genuine gift for seeing what each student needed, taught us to look and then to see 2 different things, he said always. Most people look. The work of art is learning to see. I had started the class on a whim, honestly. A friend from book club had mentioned it. I'd always thought I wasn't creative. That was a story I'd carried since a teacher in 4th grade had made some offhand comment about my drawing that had lodged in me and stayed. But I signed up anyway that winter, because the evenings had grown very long and I needed somewhere to put myself on Thursday nights. What I discovered, somewhere in the middle of that summer, was that painting was the first thing in a long time that asked absolutely nothing of me except to be present with it. There was no relationship to manage, no expectations to meet. There was just the canvas and the light and the color and my own attention, moving over a surface, trying to find what was true. I started going to the class early. I started staying late, talking to William about technique, asking questions I'd never have thought to ask 6 months earlier. I bought better paints. I set up a small workspace in the spare bedroom, Megan's old room, which I had kept so carefully, so reverently, as though preserving it in amber might preserve something of her inside it. I bought a long table for that room. I covered it in a plastic sheet. I put my paints out in little organized rows, and I hung a clip light over the work surface, and on the evenings when I wasn't at class, I went in there and I worked. Sometimes badly, often badly, but I worked. There was a garden too. I'd always had a garden, but I'd tended it the way I tended many things in those years, adequately, functionally enough to produce something without ever quite sinking into the pleasure of it. This summer I let myself sink. I planted things without practical consideration, flowers that had no use except their beauty. I spent Saturday mornings on my knees in the dirt, pulling weeds, deadheading blooms, feeling the soil between my fingers with an attention I'd never allowed myself before. The neighbor's cat took to sitting on the fence above me, watching with that serene feline confidence, and I started talking to her, just narrating my work. It sounds eccentric, and maybe it was, but it was also the most honest conversation I was having for a while. Diane and I started a Tuesday morning walk. Nothing formal, we just showed up at each other's door at 8 o'clock with coffee and travel mugs and walked for an hour through the neighborhood. We talked about everything and nothing. About our children, our health, the books we were reading, the things we remembered, and the things we were trying to let go of. Those walks became one of the most sustaining things in my life. The rhythm of it, the company, the complete absence of performance. I called Megan once a month, no more than that. I kept the calls moderate in length and followed her lead on depth. When she seemed open, I went there carefully. When she seemed guarded, I stayed at the surface. I stopped counting days between calls. I stopped carrying the anticipation of them like a stone in my chest. And somewhere in those months, I couldn't tell you exactly when, the quality of our conversations began to shift. She called me in September. A Saturday mid-morning, I was in the garden, my hands dirty, the cat on the fence. "Mom, are you busy?" "No, just in the garden, let me just hold on." I pulled off my gloves and sat down on the old wooden bench by the roses. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi," a pause. "I've been thinking about you." "Good things, I hope," I said lightly. A small laugh. "Yes, good things." Another pause, and then, "How are you actually doing, like really?" I looked at the roses. They were late season, still holding on, stubborn and pink. "I'm actually doing pretty well," I said, and I meant it. She was quiet for a moment. Yeah, the garden's been good this year. I've been painting. Diane and I walk on Tuesdays. I think I've been figuring some things out." "I'm glad," she said, and her voice had something in it that I recognized from a long time ago, something unguarded, something like her younger self. We talked for almost 2 hours that Saturday. I can't reproduce all of it, and some of it I want to keep private, held in the space where it belongs. But I'll say this, we talked honestly. She told me things about that period, about the weight she'd been carrying, the guilt, the complicated love she'd always had for me that was full of both devotion and a kind of claustrophobia she'd never known how to name. I listened. I didn't defend myself, not reflexively. I just listened. And I told her carefully, honestly, without accusation, some of what that spring had been like for me. The gray weeks, the accounting, what I'd come to understand about myself. She was quiet for a long time after that. "Mom," she said finally, "I didn't want to hurt you." "I know," I said, "I know that. I just needed—" "You needed what you needed," I said, "and you were right to say so. It took me a while to understand that, but I understand it now." I am not going to tell you that everything was fixed after that call. Life doesn't work in those satisfying narrative arcs where one conversation resolves what years have complicated. What I'll tell you is that something opened between us, a small, careful window, and we have been since then tending it, both of us. She came to visit in October. The real October, the beautiful one, the weekend when all the maples went orange and the air had that specific cold, clear quality that makes you feel very alive. She came alone. Ryan had a thing with his family, and she stayed for 3 nights, sleeping in my old guest room that I'd converted into my art studio. I cleared a corner for a little air mattress, and she didn't seem to mind. We walked around the neighborhood. We sat in the garden. I cooked the things she loved as a child, the chicken soup, the bread from scratch, the birthday cake frosting that still never quite looks right, and she sat at the kitchen counter while I cooked. Her legs didn't dangle anymore, but she had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and the quality of it, the feeling in that kitchen, was something I hadn't let myself hope for. We didn't talk about the hard things the whole time. We didn't need to. Sometimes the ordinary is the healing. Before she left on Sunday morning, she stood at the front door with her bag over her shoulder and hugged me for a long time, longer than usual. I held her, feeling how grown and solid and her own person she had become, and I did not hold on too tight. I held on just enough. "I love you, Mom," she said into my shoulder. "I love you too," I said, "so much." I stood on the porch and watched her car pull away and turn at the corner, and I felt the feelings that came, the missing, the love, the old ache, and I let them move through me without trying to stop them or fix them or transform them into something else. They were mine, they belonged here, and they would pass and I would be okay and she would be okay, and we would find our way to each other again, different than before, but real. That much I knew. What do I know now that I didn't know then? What has all of this taught me? I know that love is not the same thing as holding on. I held on because letting go felt like losing, and in some ways it was a kind of loss, the loss of the particular closeness we had when she was young and needed me and I was the center of her world. That closeness was real, it was good, and it ended the way it was supposed to end because children are supposed to grow away from their parents. That is not failure. That is exactly what you raised them to do. I know that I had built too much of my identity around being Megan's mother. Not in a pathological way, in a very human, very understandable way that millions of women build themselves around their children because for years that is where the meaning is most concentrated, most immediate, most certain. But a self built only around someone else is a fragile thing, and when that person begins to move away, as they must, as they should, you have nothing to stand on. I am learning to stand on my own 2 feet at 62. Some days I feel ridiculous about that. Other days I feel genuinely proud. I know that my daughter loves me. It does not look exactly the way I imagined it would look from here, from this chapter of life. She does not call every Sunday. She does not need me the way she once did. She is building a life of her own design with a husband and a home and a set of choices that reflect who she is, and I am in that life, in the margins sometimes, in the center occasionally, always somehow present in the background of the person she became. That is enough. It has to be enough. And the surprising thing, the thing I would not have believed if you'd told me in the gray weeks of that April, is that it actually is. I know that the work of a mother does not end when the children leave. It changes. It becomes something more interior, more quiet, the ongoing practice of loving someone with open hands, of wanting for them what they want for themselves, of finding your own fullness so that your love is something you offer freely rather than something you extend from emptiness. That is harder than anything I've done, and I'm still doing it. On Thursday evenings, I go to my art class. William has started showing my work in the small community gallery he curates, nothing grand, just local, just small, but I stood in front of one of my paintings last month hanging on a wall under gallery lights and felt something expand in my chest that I didn't have a word for. Pride, maybe, or recognition, or just the particular pleasure of having made something real from nothing. The garden sleeps now under its autumn mulch. I walk with Diane on Tuesday mornings, our breath visible in the cold air, our conversation moving through everything and landing nowhere in particular, which is exactly where it should be. And on some evenings, quiet evenings in the house that is mine and that I have come slowly to love again for what it is rather than mourn for what it no longer contains, I sit in my kitchen with a cup of tea that is actually hot this time and I think about my daughter. I think about the August day she was born. I think about the kitchen counter and the chocolate milk and the questions she always had to ask. I think about the woman she has become, capable and clear-eyed and sometimes unknowable to me, but always underneath the same person who sat in that sunlit kitchen and asked why bread rises. And I love her with everything I have. And I let her go. Over and over, every day, I let her go. Because that is what love asks of you in the end, not to hold on, but to hold open, open hands, open heart, open door, and trust that what is real between you will find its way back. It does, not always in the way you expected, not always in the shape you hoped for, but love, when it is honest and patient and willing to grow, does find its way. I believe that. I have to believe that. And most mornings, standing in my kitchen with my coffee, watching the light come through the window and fall across the floor in that particular early morning way that always makes my house look a little like a painting. I do. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you recognize something in it, some feeling or some season of your own life, I hope you'll share it in the comments below. Not because I have answers, I don't, but because there is something so sustaining, so genuinely comforting about knowing that someone else has sat in the same silence and found their way through it. You're not alone in this, whatever this is for you. If this story moved you, if it gave you even a moment of feeling seen, please consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, honest and unhurried and real, I hope you'll come back. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere.